Hello, and welcome to Demystifying Diagnostics with your host, me, Chelsea Abbott. All right, I'm not even going to spend any time talking. I'm just going to go ahead and get right into it. You know why you're here. You clicked. All right, let's go. Okay, so diagnostic process. We all have to deal with it. We're all trying to help plants that have problems, but first step to helping a plant that has a problem is diagnosing what's going on. Technically, if we treat without diagnostics or a proper diagnostic process, that's malpractice. So we don't want to be doing that. We want to know what the problem is and then respond to the problem. And all of that comes back to diagnostics. So in this talk, we're going to really break down field diagnostics. Hopefully to the point where you'll be able to replicate said process. And I do teach a process of diagnostics. There are going to be some symptoms and signs of common diseases in insects, but I'm not going to identify them. I'm going to teach you about the why we're talking about symptoms and signs. And you might be asking, why, Chelsea? Why do you do this to us? It's because a process is repeatable. It's a skill set. It's not just memorizing, ooh, I see this leaf spot, therefore it must be this disease. And that's certainly helpful and certainly easy to do at the beginning. But what I see happen, and I spelled symptoms wrong, but let's pretend that's not there. What I see happening when people are, doing the memorization thing is sometimes they can accidentally miss things. And that's what we're trying to avoid, because if you miss something and misdiagnose it again, we get to this problem. So I teach a process. It's like a teach a person to fish kind of scenario. Teach a person to diagnose instead of just memorizing everything, which I know is annoying, but trust me, there's a purpose, there's a method to my madness. All right, so before we get into the actual diagnostic process and breaking it down, I do want to say there are two plant problems that you will come across out in the world, okay? Abiotic and biotic. And I'm sure many of you have already heard these, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But basically, the difference between abiotic and biotic is one is caused by non-living things, and one is related to living things. It's in the name, right? Abiotic, non-living, biotic, living. So these are kind of our two groupings of our issues that we're going to go through, or that we would see out in the world. A great way to understand this as well, if you don't like the living versus not, another way that I highly recommend you at least be able to categorize abiotic versus not, or abiotic versus biotic, is non-infectious versus infectious. And the reason why I put a lot of emphasis on this is because it's going to help us later when we talk about patterns. And I'll give you the reason why. So if we were thinking about abiotic issues, my very lovely example I love to use is poor Johnny here, went out into the winter and got hypothermia. Now, if Johnny came back into the house and was around the other people, could he then infect everybody else with hypothermia? The answer is, of course, no, because hypothermia is an abiotic, which is non-infectious, non-transmittable. But if we look in that contrast and put this poor person here who's got a little bit of a cold, if we assume that cold is being caused by a virus or a bacteria, if this person came into the house, could they then infect other people in the mansion? And the answer, of course, is yes, because this person is infected with a biotic something, a living something which is infectious and transmittable. And when we talk about patterns and talking about spread, knowing which one spreads and which one isn't is a good decider between abiotic and biotic issues. So the diagnostic process, let's get into it, all right? I know that when we think about diagnostics, we just think about knowing all the diseases, knowing all the insects, knowing all the environmental abiotic issues that can get on the plant. And that's helpful to know those things, but I really want to back us up and focus more on the process for reasons I've already stated. And I've come up with an acronym of the diagnostic process, demystification step number 1. And this acronym that I've come up with is my crowning glory. It is my greatest achievement thus far in my career. All right, so the diagnostic process can be remembered by remembering PSPS, or PSPS, like calling a kitty to you. Yes, I do love a good kitty. And so we're just going to remember PSPS. That's our diagnostic process. Plant ID, symptoms, pattern of those symptoms, and then signs. And we'll break each one of these down as we go. But important is not only knowing that acronym, PSPS, but knowing the order of that acronym. We do not want to try to go backwards within the diagnostic process, meaning trying to find a sign and then making everything else make sense. It's much more difficult to do it that way. We want to go, as my reverse funnel system. Oh, I'm covering up poor Frank, but it is the reverse funnel system of the diagnostic process, meaning we work sequentially from this point to this point to this point to this point, and we technically cannot move on with the diagnostic process if we can't complete one of these points. Because if you skip, again, you're skipping information. And particularly this first step, if you don't know what you're looking at, then you can't actually proceed with the diagnostic process. And the reason why I stress going this way and not just sort of coming up with a problem and trying to find supporting information is because identifying a problem or deciding it's a problem. For example, I decided that this crab apple has apple scab. I'm going to find evidence to support that it has apple scab. This is called inductive reasoning. What we want to do is look at all of the evidence that we're seeing and then come to a conclusion that it's apple scab, because this is deductive reasoning. And this is what true detectives do. And aren't we just trying to all be plant detectives? So that's why it's important to go sequentially through the diagnostic process. But let's break down what the diagnostic process actually is step by step. So the first step is plant ID. Knowing your plant and knowing what's normal for that plant is the most important step to the diagnostic process, because it actually supplies you a lot of information. So if you did know what this plant was, maybe scream it out now. It's a white pine. The next question you have is, what should this white pine look like? And does this white pine look normal? Now, if you didn't know it was a white pine, you wouldn't know technically what was normal for that species. And this happens plenty of times, especially when we're coming across certain cultivars that maybe look a little bit different than the species we might have learned in our tree ID. If we don't know that it's a cultivar that's, say, meant to have lighter green needles, then we could actually misdiagnose this for being something like chlorosis or a nutrient issue. But if we knew that this was a cultivar, for example, we would know that it has lighter green needles than what's more normal for us, even though this is normal for the species. So again, knowing your species is very important, because you can't diagnose something that isn't there. But also knowing your species, especially if you're beginning to start out, helps you understand what are the possibilities of what can get onto the species. Now, I know that's a little bit of inductive reasoning, but as you work through the process of diagnostics, knowing that, okay, hey, we're looking at a white pine and here are the general issues that can get on it, it can help make sense the symptoms and the signs and the patterns that we're going to see further on. The other thing that knowing your plant ID will do is understanding in general what are the cultural conditions that this plant prefers. What's the light that it likes? What's the amount of water? What's the amount of or type of soil? And that will help you when we think about our abiotic problems, which are going to be quite tricky. Because we know that, for example, a white pine might not like to be in oversaturated soil that doesn't drain well. Knowing that this is clay might help us understand why it's having these symptoms. So plant ID is the first step, and it's the most important step. You cannot proceed without knowing your plant. The next step to the diagnostic process, the S in the first is symptoms. Now, symptoms are a plant reaction to something, and this is very critical that you know that it is a plant's reaction. And there can be plenty of different symptoms. I'll just give you a few. Cupping or curling, that is a plant reaction to something. Blight or necrosis. Necrosis is just a fun way of saying browning. It really just means death of cells. Blight is death of multiple different types of tissues, leaves, branches, berries, etc. So we can have blight, necrosis, cupping or curling. We can have chlorosis, defoliation is another symptom, stunting is a symptom. Oh, my face is covering it up, but beneath me is a canker, and now cankers are a symptom. They are a reaction, and cankers are really just necrotic wounds, usually found on the branches or on the trunk. We can have rosetting, and rosetting is really just when the tissues become stunted or collected on witch's brooming at the tips, and you get sort of a deformed growth. So symptoms don't just have to be death, they can also be deformation. Speaking of deformation, galls. Galls are actually symptoms. It's tumor-like growth. One of the things I usually will say also to help people understand symptoms is, did the plant make this, or is this made out of plant tissue? This helps particularly with galls. Galls are just plant tissue. It's just tumorous plant growth. Those are all symptoms, reactions to something. Now, the first P of our, or second P of our is patterns, and this is the most critical step in the diagnostic process. It's also the most annoying step, mostly because patterns can be a little bit subjective, but I'm going to give you some overarching general patterns just to help you understand what I'm talking about. So in general, we can put patterns into two categories: non-uniform or irregularly symptoms showing up, or uniform symptoms showing up. With non-uniform, that's going to mean random branches, random leaves, just sort of sporadically sprinkled, not only within the host, but across a landscape. It's very important when we're talking about patterns over space. We're talking internal canopy as well as across the whole landscape. And typically, whenever we see irregular or random things showing up in a landscape or in the canopy, it's usually caused by a living factor, aka a biotic factor, like insects or pathogens. Now, contrast this with a uniform pattern. This is a pattern that's going to be either across a whole space or within a tree that isn't random, that is going to be either a certain age of leaves. It's going to be seen over a wide area across multiple species. So it's not just crab apples, not just white pines. It's going to be many different types of species. And typically when we see patterns that are widespread or very uniform within the canopy, those are going to be caused by non-living factors or abiotic issues. For example, frost would be a great one. Frost will burn anything that has leaves out at the time of the frost, whereas let's say a defoliating insect, let's go with spongy moth, will most predominantly show up on, say, oaks and certain other key species, but just not everybody in the landscape. So there's your good example of a uniform versus a non-uniform pattern. But just to drive it home, because I know patterns can be tricky, I want to show you uniform pattern. Look at all the boxwoods. Not only are they all showing the same symptom, it's across the whole space. Everybody at the same time, same amount showed these symptoms. Versus an irregular pattern shown here. Here we've got more just only specifically the maples on this street are showing symptoms, but within the maples you can see there's a different amount of symptoms on each one of them. A trick I like to teach about trying to define the pattern is draw circles with your eyes, and I can draw a circle right now. So if I were to draw a circle around these boxwoods of the symptoms, I would end up drawing a circle around all of the boxwoods to encapsulate the symptom. Versus if I was to draw circles around symptoms on the picture of these maples, I would kind of be drawing a bunch of circles, but they would be not only different sizes, Some have more symptoms than others. There are also different locations in the canopy or of these trees. And so you can see here one large symptom here versus many large or many small and large symptoms on this right picture shows a uniform pattern versus an irregular pattern. It's just sort of a trick that I like to teach. Draw circles around the symptoms, and that might help you figure out if it's irregular or not. Okay, so we discussed patterns of symptoms over space. Now it's in time to talk about patterns of symptoms over time. That's right, space and time. Just like the Gallifreyans, we must consider both. That was a Doctor Who reference if you don't know. But noting the patterns of symptoms over time is going to be incredibly important and oftentimes the most forgotten part of patterns. So if we're talking spread of symptoms within a canopy, just within one host, there's two patterns that I can give you that are helpful. Bottom up canopy spread, meaning it starts at the very bottom and moves its way upwards, is typically going to be a foliar fungal disease. Top down canopy spread, starting from the top and moving downwards, is typically going to be a vascular limiting issue, meaning water transport. Now, this one's much less helpful and much less specific than the bottom up because there are so many things that can cause vascular disruptions or disruptions within water transport within the tree. So it's not going to tell you so much what did it, it's just going to help you know that, okay, something's limiting the water. Let's figure out why the water isn't getting from point A to point B. But if we're talking about the spread of symptoms over multiple species, remember old poor Johnny Boy and that poor person who had a little bit of a cold spreading. A symptom moving from one plant to the other is infectious, meaning it's something that's going to be pinging on down the line. That's typically going to be have us thinking that this is probably caused by a biotic and infectious agent. If it's not spreading at all, that would be something that's more abiotic because abiotics are not infectious and not transmittable. Now, if it's continuing to spread on the same plant, now I want to be clear, this one's not as cut and dry. Time to death or time to spread of the symptoms within the plant can be helpful. So I'll give an example of two problems that happen on oak, one abiotic and one biotic. Oak decline is predominantly an abiotic environmental issue, and it takes years for that oak to die from it. Versus oak wilt, which is a fungal vascular problem on oaks, takes weeks for some species of oaks to die from that pathogen. So both spread, both get worse, but one's a little bit faster than the other and therefore a bit more noticeable. Typically, if you're standing at a plant, you're not going to know that it's been going on for 10 plus years. So that's what makes abiotics difficult to diagnose versus something that you visited once and then you maybe come back 3 weeks later and it's so much worse. That's either means that it is biotic or that whatever might be abiotic or environmental has not stopped, meaning, for example, drought will continue to get worse if the people don't water the plant. All right, so spread of symptoms over time. It's also good to note what time of the year the symptoms are showing up. For example, foliar diseases typically their symptoms appear either in spring or late summer. Whereas foliar insects, the timing of those symptoms appearance will typically coincide with the life cycle. Know thy life cycle with the insects. If you know that spongy moth has hatched recently and is in its feeding stages and you see leaf holes, that might help you out, all right? Environmental issues or vascular issues, for example, vascular issues that are not considered environmental would be things like borers, rots, or vascular wilt, typically are going to either show up in the earlier parts of the season or the hottest time of the year. For the early season ones, these are either lag from the previous symptoms, drought, stress, or frost. For the hottest time of the year, you'll see any vascular issue, any limiting thing during the hottest time of year because that's when the water is most limiting. And when the water is most limiting, you'll start to see the symptoms up in the very tippy tops of our canopy. So This is the last step of our diagnostic process. We went through our PSPS, all right? And finally, we are at signs. But I want to make sure everyone understands what I mean when I say signs. Signs are not the thing that you see, because you can also see symptoms. Signs are what is causing the symptom. It is the physical presence of the causal agent. So in examples with insects themselves, this guy is the sign. It is the causal agent. It's like finding a toddler drawing on a wall. The toddler is the sign, all right? You are looking at the causal agent of that damage. Other things that insects can be considered signs are going to be their leave behind. So either you have the insect itself or what it left behind. Remember, is it a plant part? Did the plant make it? If the plant didn't make it, if it's not a plant part, then it's not a sign. So cocoons be a little tricky because you're like, but Chelsea, these bagworms are made out of plant parts. Yeah, but the plant didn't make these bags. The insect did. So cocoons are a sign. Exit holes are a sign. Frass or insect poop or honeydew are all signs of insects. Again, it's the insect itself or it's its leave behind. Eggs could be signs as well, but I don't have a picture. For diseases, it gets a little bit more tricky because they're just harder to find signs-wise. Let's start off easier with our macro example, our wood decay fungus. So wood decay fungus, the symptom, the cause would be decay. The fungus itself is the sign. So when you find the mushroom on the tree, that's the sign of wood decay. You're looking at the toddler, okay? It gets a little bit more tricky with other diseases because the actual sign of the disease is much more difficult to find. Technically, these little tiny fruiting bodies, that's what these little black pimple-like structures are, and that's what most diseases look like, are the same as this guy. They're just way less obvious to find. They're both the reproductive structure of the fungus. One of them is just macro, one of them is just micro. So this is the predominant what we would see for signs of diseases, of fungi diseases. For bacterial diseases, it's very, very rare that you will see the sign, which is just ooze. You need perfect conditions in order to find it, so typically you won't see the sign of bacteria problems out in the landscape, and that's kind of the issue with disease diagnosis in general, is generally you need microscopes to see the signs of diseases. So it's a little bit harder. So if you're just starting out with your diagnostic process, I always recommend start with insects. Get your insects down. Then you can move to diseases, and then you'll start to work on your abiotics. But that's kind of the process, I would say, as far as like ease to hard, all right? So, but these are all signs. These are all the actual causal agents of symptoms. And they're the last step for a reason because they're typically very difficult to find. Sometimes they might not be there, so you might have to rely upon your other steps in order to diagnose what you're doing. Okay, so that's the diagnostic process. Remember, PSPS or PSPS, like you're calling a kitty to you. And if you ever get adopted by a cat because you've remembered and done my diagnostic process, you immediately must tell me and then send me a picture of the cat. But remember, we move sequentially, PSPS, kitty comes to us, we've diagnosed the problem. Excellent, I'm so happy for you. But let's actually like put this into some real terms, right? We can talk about the process all day, but like what does it mean? And now I'm gonna show you something, you're gonna hate me, but don't worry, I'm gonna break it down, okay? I know, right? It looks scary, but trust me, it's gonna be okay. Okay, so I've made this diagnostic flowchart for you to help you actually apply the diagnostic process out in the world, all right? I'm sorry, Rachel. But here's what we've got. All of these problems are very common problems, but they are not all encompassing. I do want to point that out. Secondly, these are all based upon the diagnostic process. So you still need to do the diagnostic process because that's what's going to inform you as you move through this flow chart. So don't think you can skip that, but we are going to work our way through this diagnostic flow chart. We're going to start with, are the symptoms on one host or are they on many hosts? That's our big separator. If they're on one host, we're going to start over here. If they're on more than one host, we'll get there later. But I'm going to break down each one of these, okay? So let's go. Let's do it. Okay, so we've noted that the pattern of symptoms is only on one host. So we're starting to think that maybe we're dealing with a biotic issue. What if we notice that there's only leaf symptoms, but those leaf symptoms are sporadically throughout the canopy on the branches? And I will help you define what sporadic means when we talk about these next sections. But let's just focus in on things that can cause sporadic leaf symptoms. Those are going to be foliar fungal diseases, foliar sucking insects, and chewing insects. Okay, so leaf symptoms and their patterns. Remember when I said that bottom-up pattern applied to a foliar fungal diseases? This is one of the main diseases that causes foliar problems in plants. So that's great. Knowing that we have a bottom-up pattern, excellent. That really leans us towards a foliar fungal. Easy. But if we start to see more sporadic, random, dispersed without really a discernible pattern, that can be a couple different things. Typically our foliar insects or maybe some bacterial foliar diseases that don't follow this bottom-up pattern, because bacterial foliar diseases shouldn't. That's sort of the point. This is very fungal, all right? Typically, though, I will note that whenever you are diagnosing just leaf issues, not whole branch problems or whole tree problems, you really want to also focus in like the type of leaf spot you're looking at, the color of it. Is it showing up on the margins? Is it showing up closer to the veins? As well as characteristic signs should be present. So I'll show you a couple images of some symptoms of foliar problems. All right, so here are our just general leaf symptoms. And again, I'm not going to go into exactly what caused all of these because I just want you to understand the flow chart and the process. So typically we can have either necrotic leaves, leaves that are just simply brown, or we can have necrotic leaf spots or leaf blotches. Now, blotches are just spots that have started to coalesce. So you can have little spots scattered all over, or you can have coalesced spots that become blotches. The color and the location of those spots might be helpful to note. Noting that the leaves simply just went brown, you notice this bottom-up pattern, by the way, or if the leaves had a spot or a blotch is going to be helpful, as well as where is that blotch? Is it concentrated around the margins? Is it mostly concentrated around the leaf veins? Is it speckled all over? Is it randomly throughout? Do the leaf spots themselves have other characteristic symptoms? For example, in this one, this leaf spot also has a very characteristic yellow halo around it, and that can be very helpful. Or if we flip over into, say, more of these two are diseases, if we flip over more into our insect leaf symptoms, you'll notice we have more deformation, cupping and curling, or completely loss of tissue, whereas the diseases the tissue stays, it just dies. With our insects, cupping or curling, also stippling or this bleached look can be a symptom of a piercing sucking insect, and then of course chewing holes or skeletonization would be more a symptom of a defoliating insect. Now, with our signs of our foliar problems, again, I mentioned most foliar diseases that are caused by fungi will have these little black pimple-like structures, and that's going to be the fruiting body. Remember, these are the signs. But fungi can create other signs that are going to be helpful for us. For example, with powdery mildew, the sign here is going to be this white fluff. This white fluff is the mycelia or the hyphae, which is the growing stage of the fungus. So we have a reproductive stage and we have a growing/eating stage. So this sign here is mycelia. Rusts are a fungal disease that create fruiting bodies that look a little bit different than these black pimple-like structures. They're more hair-like, but I wanted to show you not only these hair-likes, but some of this orange stuff, and then here on my finger. This orange stuff are spores. Spores are the fungal itself. Think of them like it's like the pollen of the fungi. If this is the flower, this is the pollen, right? But technically, this is all the causal agent of the symptoms. So these are going to be the sign. Again, with our insects, it's a little bit easier. We either have our leave behinds, like our cocoons or egg masses, the insect itself, as you can see here, these spider mites, which technically are not insects, but they would be, causing problems, as well as scale. All three are going to be different types of insects. They are the sign. We can also see some leave behinds. Right here we have our honeydew, which is a leave behind from a piercing sucking insect, as well as frass or poop, and webbing, another leave behind from a piercing sucking insect like aphid or spider mites. All right, so just remember these are all going to be associated with those leaf spots, with that cupping and curling, with the stippling, etc. So signs of foliar diseases or foliar problems are going to be typically associated with foliar symptoms, all happening on the leaf, like a little tiny microcosm. All right, now let's go into the middle. So if the symptoms are sporadically on the branches, just specifically on the leaves, and you've checked for these three things, great. But what about if the branch is dieback? The leaves are necrotic, but it looks more like a whole branch going down rather than just random leaves here and there scattered throughout the canopy or throughout the branch. You just notice the entire branch looks brown. You have some options as well. So you have vascular wilts, you can have cankers or stem galls. Remember, galls are just tumors. They can be caused by insects as well as diseases. Or you can have branch-sucking insects, for example, like scale. But let's get into what I'm talking about when I say branch dieback. So we can have sectional branch dieback, and that means the branches are going to be dying from the tip backwards. They're going to sort of almost start in the middle and then either spread outwards like that or spread upwards, but eventually they're going to kind of create this wedge shape or pie shape within the canopy. All branch dieback across the whole board can be traced back to a single point. Different than our just leaf symptoms, those can't be traced back to some point. There are going to be green leaves scattered in with the brown leaves, but in this case you should be able to see that all of the leaves have the same symptom, and it's pretty non-distinct of a leaf symptom. We'll get there, but they'll be traced back to a point because the problem is not on the leaf, it's on the branch, right? And again, like I said, our vascular wilts are bacterial leaf scorches, but also some of the abiotic problems like mechanical damage can be all doing this type of branch dieback pattern. Versus more of a sporadic branch dieback pattern. So this is when we're not really creating wedge shapes. We're not really seeing that it's like a slice of a pie stuck in our canopy. What we're seeing is more just random sporadic branches sort of scattered throughout the whole canopy. And this is important to different amounts. Some branches will be much more necrotic than others. They'll still be able to be traced back to a point, but there will be more numerous points throughout the canopy. And typically when we see a more sporadic random branch dieback pattern, we're more looking at our cankers, our galls, either insects or diseases, or our branch sucking insects. So let's look at a little bit of the symptoms that we would see with branch dieback, just so you can visualize the difference between when I showed you just the foliar problems. And remember, with our foliar problems, there should be distinctive symptoms on the leaves themselves. For example, blotches or speckles, different coloration. You should be able to see some leaves green, some leaves brown. They won't all be dead. In this instance, the whole branch is dead. And then when you zero in on the leaves themselves, they should just be brown. There shouldn't be any haloing, there shouldn't be any speckling, there shouldn't be any blotches or spots or stippling, cupping, or curling. The leaves are just dry, dusty brown. Because again, what's really happening here versus our foliar problems where the insect or the disease is actually landing on the leaf, sucking out the cells or sucking out the juices from the cells in that one spot, all right? And that's how it kills. In this instance, with our branch dieback, you're actually having the problem land on the branch and it sucks all the juices or disrupts here, and then the water and nutrients simply just don't get to the leaves, so they die from water and nutrient loss. And so it just sort of looks like drought because that's kind of what's happening here. I do want to show you sort of some of the difference that I'm talking about between sectional, where you can see almost wedge-shaped patterns within our canopies. You can see here at best with this is caused by a vascular wilt, a very pie shape sort of look versus a more sporadic, random throughout the whole canopy type of look. Again, it's not a cut and dry thing, but it should be a little bit helpful for at least your vascular wilts, which will tend to be more pie shaped, and more of our cankers and our stem galls that tend to be a little bit more sporadically throughout the canopy. I do want to also give you the image of other symptoms though. Remember, you're looking at these dead leaves, you're like, what caused this? Track it back, work your way back, and maybe you'll find a gall or a tumor, that's a symptom. Maybe you'll find a canker like these two here. Those are also symptoms. And now you can see that symptoms will actually start to relate to each other. In this case, these cankers is what cut off the vascular system, which caused this. So you're going to be like, it's a sign. No, it's a symptom because this is still plant material. The fungus that caused this canker is the sign. So to demonstrate that more clearly, what I mean between the symptoms and the signs with our branch problems is with our signs of the branch problems, when we're talking about the fungus itself, again, fruiting bodies. So if you see here these little tiny orange pimple-like structures, that's the fruiting body. That's the fungus itself. It lives inside the canker, causing the canker. Same here, you can see these are also fruiting bodies or of the fungus that causes the canker that then relates to the dieback. And then vascular staining. Now this one's tricky because technically vascular staining or streaking is also a symptom, but I'm going to put it under here under signs because this is actually the fungus itself as well. And it's sort of, I would say, a field way of finding a vascular wilt. So Dutch elm disease, oak wilt, verticillium, laurel wilt should make vascular staining like this, and that's where the pathogen actually exists, clogging the vascular system and feeding on it. So technically it's a symptom, but it's also a sign. For our insects, again, it gets a little bit easier. You can find the insect on the branch itself feeding, for example, like here in scale, that is the sign of the dieback that's happening farther down the line. You can also see sometimes in the case of a cicada, that cicada is the sign as well as its eggs here from the mechanical damage that it caused from egg laying. These are leave behinds, eggs are leave behinds. For things that burrow in to our branches, sometimes you can have exit holes, you can have galleries, or you can have this pitch mass, which is a mixture of the sawdust and frass from the internal feeding of some borer insects on the conifers. So technically these would all be signs that would then relate to the symptoms we would see with branch dieback. Okay, so we looked at our patterns that on our one host that's having the issues. Leaf symptoms sporadically, branch dieback where the whole branch is going down. Now let's talk about what happens when the whole tree goes down. And this is a little bit tricky between the two because sometimes the difference between these is time, meaning it can start as branch dieback and then quickly progress to full canopy dieback. For example, within our vascular wilt. So you'll see we actually have a double whammy here. Vascular wilts can start out wedge-shaped, working one branch, and then very quickly progress within a year, sometimes a couple weeks, to full canopy decline. So keep that in mind. Some of these things can be in both areas. Other things that can cause full canopy, so we're talking the very top parts moving their whole way down, not just one branch here. It's all of the branches up at the top. You can also have borers as well as wood rots, all right? Again, I want you to make sure that as you're working through this flowchart, you're also looking at these little descriptions because I've put in some important diagnostic information that should help you decide if it is a wood rot. For example, finding punky, discolored roots or in the buttress system is a symptom, or finding the sign, the fruiting body itself, is going to help you diagnose this wood rot. So it's not just about these overarching patterns. There's important information below that as well. So for our crown dieback pattern, where we're starting up at the tippy tops of the crown and we're working our way down, this can be rapid or this can be gradual. And really this all depends upon the virulence of the disease or the susceptibility of the host. Meaning, for example, with our oak wilt, we have red oaks that will die in 3 weeks and we have white oaks that will die in 3 years. And that's fully because one is more susceptible than the other. If we think about our insect problems, conifer hosts tend to be much more susceptible to borers and the symptoms and damage caused by them than our deciduous hosts. So generally conifers typically go up in smoke when they have their vascular system disrupted, versus deciduous trees take a little bit longer when they're being attacked by borers. Now, like branch dieback, crown issues can be traced back to a single point, but it usually happens to either be the trunk or the root system. So it's just our point of damage is just sort of getting lower. The lower down we go, the more symptoms we see in our canopy. And like I've mentioned previously, here are some of the issues that can cause crown dieback pattern. So we have our symptoms. Again, I just want to show you. You notice it's very top down, very tip back, because really, like branch issues, the problem is a vascular disruption, a disruption of water from point A to point B, but the point is just lower. Again, trunk or root system. So the farther down you go, the more damage that you see. So in the case of just crown dieback, it's not super distinct leaf patterns either. They're just necrotic leaves, brown leaves that don't have any distinctive symptoms or signs on the leaf itself, because again, it's more of a vascular issue. And you'll notice that it'll just work its way downwards, sometimes over years, sometimes over a couple weeks, depending upon what we're talking about here. One of the other crown dieback symptoms is, of course, if we're talking about root rots or buttress rots, would be staining or necrosis or rot of the base, which is also technically a symptom. So in some cases, again, like with branch dieback, you can have multiple symptoms sort of responding to the causal agent, depending on what the causal agent is. For signs, for our vascular wilts, it's the same exact thing as when we had our branch dieback. Again, it would just be more located in the whole tree rather than just in the branches themselves. For our wood rots or our decay organisms, the signs are much easier because they are macro. And then for our insects, we can have galleries, we can have exit holes, we can have frass, we can have any type of leave behind that would indicate that an insect is burrowing in, cutting off the vascular system, which would then lead to the full crown dieback. So now you're feeling pretty happy, right? Okay, good. So yes, this was basically the breakdown of the patterns of symptoms that we can see when we only see it on maybe one host or one specific type of host or a group of hosts. Again, thinking it's mostly biotic. But what you might be thinking now is, wait a minute, there was a whole other side to this. So let's go ahead and look at that. So what about the other side? I will remind you that the big difference between the two sides of the flowchart that I showed you is one or select hosts versus many hosts, which ultimately is a pattern of symptoms and a really big one. It's basically uniform versus irregular. So remember the pss, don't forget the pss, the kitties will need you, right? PSPS, go through this process and then go through the flowchart, because the flowchart really relies upon you having already looked at a lot of these things, okay? Good. Okay, so let's talk about this side. Now, we are on to abiotics. Abiotic diagnosis, as I've said previously, should be, let's call it your end game diagnostics. Unfortunately, so many problems, I was about to say 80%, but I got that number from nowhere. So many problems out in the landscape are caused by environmental issues, and oftentimes they do coalesce on the same tree, meaning that insects and diseases are attacking trees that have only been affected by something abiotic. The reason why I say practice with your insects first and then move to your diseases and then we'll talk about abiotics is because there really aren't signs for a lot of these things. The sign of nutrient deficiency is the soil test. The sign of frost might be ice, but it's definitely not there at the time. The sign of things like construction damage or compaction, they're just a bit more abstract and they're harder to talk about with the client. So if you're just starting out and you're trying to, warm your way up to this, insects, diseases, and this, mostly to just get your confidence boost. But I do want to make sure that you don't ignore abiotic diagnosis. Like I said, it's predominantly the thing that we're dealing with, and it goes hand in hand with a lot of the insect issues. So I'm going to just talk about these briefly. There are a huge amount of abiotic issues that I have not captured on this flowchart. I didn't want to make it too overwhelming, but let's talk about some of the ones that I have outlined. Okay, so you see it on many different hosts. You see it on hosts all at the same time, meaning, again, a time and space pattern across a wide area. So we're definitely within our abiotic. Now what you notice is that the leaves are chlorotic and they have dark veins. So they're limey green with dark veins. That is a symptom, a pretty characteristic symptom of a nutrient deficiency. But please hold, that's not the end of the diagnosis. I do want to point out that the pattern of a nutrient deficiency, not just within the whole landscape, but just within the host itself, typically, if it is a micronutrient deficiency, you will see it on the older leaves first. And that's because a lot of micronutrients are mobile. Another thing I want to point out, mostly because I get a lot of questions on this, is what happens after chlorosis is necrosis always. Chlorosis is death of chlorophyll. Necrosis is death of cells. So if the chlorophyll dies, the cell dies. And so you oftentimes will see necrosis follow chlorosis, but nutrients deficiencies, micronutrient deficiencies, do this really characteristic type of necrosis where it bleeds back in between the veins and looks very stripy. So this is actually quite diagnostic of a micronutrient deficiency. But I want to point out that a micronutrient deficiency can be caused by many different things. It could be that the micronutrient is simply limiting, or it could be that there is a reason the micronutrient isn't getting from point A to point B. So sometimes this is actually a symptom of greater issues. For example, you oftentimes see micronutrient deficient symptoms during droughts or on trees that have girdling roots, something that there's not water and therefore not nutrients getting from point A to point B. So micronutrient or a nutrient deficiency diagnosis is kind of the first diagnosis. All right, soapbox over. Let's move on. Now, if you notice that the leaves themselves don't have that characteristic limey yellow with the dark veins, and they just sort of look necrotic, but not whole branch necrotic, of a certain age, and the plant itself is almost reflushing, recovering, this is most likely frost. This was a one and done frost event where everything that had leaves out, so remember your patterns across space and time, everything got burnt, and again, no distinct symptoms of those leaves really. It's just sort of necrotic leaves, sometimes stunting and curling as well, but sort of just a shock. And then a reflush. It's because that frost event is done, all right? So really what you're noticing, hopefully, is that you're not so much relying upon signs when we're doing abiotic diagnosis, you're relying upon patterns, which is why abiotic diagnosis is so tricky. One of the trickier things about frost is people forget it happened. And so oftentimes you will be weeks and weeks and weeks later, because it can take weeks to show up, and people will be like, oh no, I don't believe you, we didn't have a frost. You have to remind them that when these leaves came out is when we're talking. Not now, not 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, but like, when the leaves were actually coming out and super vulnerable to a frost. So yes, that necrotic leaves that are distinct of a certain age is most likely frost. Now let's flip to the last one. All right, now let's talk about this last section here. And this one's a biggie because you'll notice it's canopy dieback from the top down. Where did we see that before? That's right, abiotics can do it too. And that's the problem, is that abiotic symptoms oftentimes are exactly the same symptoms that we see with our biotic problems, particularly the biotic issues that affect the branches, the trunk, and the root system. Because remember, what those three things are actually doing is disrupting the vascular system. And there are plenty of abiotics. For example, I've listed some of them here: mechanical damage, stem girdling roots, compaction, drought, and flooding that also disrupt the vascular system. But remember, patterns, okay? So a big pattern, you'll see I've put a little note here, is check the growth increment between your terminal bud scars. If you see this has been gradually happening over many years, abiotic, right? It's a slow burn. Now, generally, if it's been happening for many, many years, you'll probably find some biotic issues on that tree as well. But let's ignore that just now, just for the sake of clarity. One of the other things I will mention about abiotic diagnosis in general is sometimes it can be diagnosed because there is a lack of sign, meaning you can't find a biotic sign that would, again, be a confirmation of what's happening in the symptoms. And simply by that, it's like a process of elimination. But there are some signs that abiotics make. We'll start with the easier and we'll progress to the harder. Let's start with flooding. So flooding, top-down dieback, it's a vascular issue, but the sign would actually be that oversaturation. In some cases, the standing water, in some cases, just mucky conditions where you can tell that the soil is oversaturated. With stem girdling roots or mechanical damage, it gets a little bit trickier. Sometimes there can be a sign, but a lot of times it's reactions, meaning symptoms. So bulging at the base, a flat side at the base of the tree, these can be symptoms of stem girdling roots or mechanical damage, because bulging is just a reaction to an internal issue or a below ground issue. Same thing with a flat side. So these are technically symptoms, whereas the sign of stem girdling root, or the sign, I suppose, of this vascular obstruction, even from planting problems, would be that root or that twine or whatever it might be encircling the base of the tree that then is causing that reaction, that's causing the canopy decline. Now, with like mechanical damage, you could see like the sign of mechanical damage would be like the animal or the tool that caused it, but you could see the symptoms, like for example, callus wood formation. All right, so remember your difference between your symptoms and signs. Now it gets trickier when we move over into our, let's say, more complicated soil problems like compaction, drought, root issues, construction, mostly because there's not really a sign to rely upon. Like frost and like nutrient deficiencies, a lot of times with our soil compaction, the sign is either abstract or it's a soil test, which I highly recommend. If you don't know your soil testing, you would look up some soil testing because it might help with your client. But other tools that might help you with compaction is, again, looking at those growth increments. That's a symptom, but if you want some signs, a pentrometer to show the actual compaction, or a soil profiler, like actually digging into the soil and then picking it up with your hands and showing the client. That could be a sign that would help you explain some of these more complicated issues. But I do want to point out a pattern that we're seeing in this picture alone that is a great indication of that over different species. You can see not just the tree, but also the turf is suffering in the same exact way. And oftentimes with our abiotics, other than not finding a sign or relying upon testing, a lot of abiotics are diagnosed via patterns, which is why it's one of the most important steps other than plant ID. RPs are very important. The pattern over space, over different species, is an incredibly important pattern for abiotics. So don't just zero in on what you're there to see. Make sure you're looking at the whole landscape. So hopefully that demystified the diagnostic process. Remember, these are guidelines, not rules. You know, the fungi and the insects and the environmental problems of the world don't read the book. They didn't attend this presentation. So it's meant to help, but it's obviously not meant to be the strict rules in which you go through your life. But I do want to let you know that I am here to help as a resource. You know, I am a diagnostician, so if there's anything on that flow chart or anything in this presentation that you want more information on, or you want to talk about or run things by me, here are some of my ways to reach me. And as always, don't be a stranger and stay curious.